So good morning. My name's Bill Malik. I've been with Trend for 5 years. I've been in IT as of January for 50 years, half of which has been in cybersecurity, although we didn't call it that back then. So in the course of today's session, we're going to talk about supply chain risk. We're going to use ports and maritime as an example because that is the easiest way to introduce the larger concept of what I will call hybrid supply chain vulnerabilities. And by that I mean both physical and software, because as we'll see, they're intimately connected. So we're going to begin by looking at some high-level issues about port and maritime security. Then I'm going to propose a way to do the analysis that captures both the physical and the cyber aspects. And then we're going to take a little sidestep into the way back. Len Considine wrote a paper called Composite Structure Design back in 1974. It talked about how you analyze complex systems. And we're going to apply that method to something that is analogous to the maritime supply chain. And then we're going to bring it up, apply it to maritime, and close with some references and, of course, your questions. So to begin, this session will be audio, video recorded, and may be published. Has anybody seen this before? Okay, so this is what caught my eye and made me think about developing this talk. On the left there, you see a Cypriot-registered oil tanker called Reliable, and what it's doing is it's loading a few, I guess, 100,000 barrels of oil from a port in Venezuela. Now, as you know, global shipping is monitored and regulated, and every ship has an AIS, which tells the world where it is and what it's doing. So in this particular case, while that ship was loading oil off the port in Venezuela, its AIS said that it was basking in the sun off the island of Bequia, a few hundred miles away. In other words, the ship captain intentionally messed with the AIS so that he could load oil from a sanctioned country. Now, the U.S. has sanctioned oil from Venezuela. Not a lot of the other countries have, but the reason that you want to go through this kind of subterfuge is that banks and major shippers and insurance companies don't want to tick off Uncle Sam, right? So even though you're a Cypriot-registered ship and your bank may be in Malta, you still don't want to have some international group from the U.S. coming in and saying, we don't want you to ship anymore. So this intrigued me. How hard or easy is this to do? And that's what we're going to be looking at, is how hard or easy is this kind of stuff to do. Now, those of you who followed this may recall a few years ago that the Russians were messing with the GPS systems, and so that ships in the Caspian and Black Seas were suddenly reporting that they were 20 miles inland. Now, the captains of these ships, being clever people, looked out the window and noticed that there was water on all sides, and so they decided to follow the old adage that if you ever find yourself in a situation where the terrain and the map disagree, believe the terrain. That's the first important lesson from this. So we're going to look at some maritime cyber issues. The U.S. Transcom, which is a naval agency that looks at the security of our ports, did an analysis with some students about a year ago, taking a look at security of various ports. Now, the interesting thing about ports is that no two are alike. Every port is a little different to the point that you really don't have very many useful lessons learned you can take from what you saw in Oakland to what you might see in Port of New York and New Jersey. But the things you do have in common are there are complex systems, there are cranes. These are not run by people, these are automated. There are scanners that take a look at the trucks, that take a look at the cargo units as they come in, and then there are cargo management systems that tell you where this stuff should be loaded. These cargo management systems, part of the overall supply chain, are themselves vulnerable. In fact, on a stage like this about 4 years ago, I mentioned a problem with GPS satellites. where they were all going to get wrong in about a week. I made a comment about, I don't want to be flying on May 7th or something. And the kind of problem I was worried about was that somebody would mess with the GPS, and so a container would land in the drink rather than on the ship. Well, here are the kinds of things that can happen if your container loading system is awry. On my right, on your left, you see a ship where they put the heavy stuff on the port side, and the ship tipped over. And this other one, they put the heavy containers on top of the lighter containers, and so one of the ones down there low, these are stacked 8 or 12 units high, collapsed and the whole thing went kaflooey. The other thing that can happen with ship loading is there are algorithms that tell you where to place the load. And these algorithms can be dinked with as well. On this graph on the right, you see the blue dotted line. That's the safe loading for this kind of ship. The green line is what the system told the operator it was doing. The red line, which crosses those dots, was what the hack system actually did. And as a result, in this case, the ship broke in half. Now, you can load it too much at the ends, in which case it'll snap up, or you can load it too much in the middle, it'll snap down. You can do a lot of things to mess with these, and these systems are very primitive, like a lot of industrial control systems. They do not have authentication. They do not have authorization. If you can find it on the bus, on the network, you can get into it. And at the very lowest level, my friend Joe Weiss is fond of saying that the level 0 and level 1 devices are shipped with a built-in back door. Every sensor is shipped with a built-in back door because it has to be, because you have to calibrate it in the field. It doesn't come out of the factory knowing what 100 degrees centigrade is. You put it in service, and then you use an Allen wrench or you use an app on your phone to calibrate that device. And so the sensor that tells you what the load is itself is highly vulnerable. So let's take a look at the shipping supply chain. We're going to take a look at the components of smart ports. A ship like this is a super hauler, holds over 20,000 units. The cranes, one crane can load one container per minute. In other words, it takes almost 2 weeks, if you only have one crane, to unload one of these things. Now, of course, they have more than one crane. It goes more quickly, but it's all software controlled. Okay. What goes in there and what comes out is entirely software defined. There's no human being saying, well, let's put this over here, playing some advanced phone-like game. The port architecture is equally sophisticated and complex, and they're all one-off. There's no common standard for what an effective port architecture is. Some ports are run by the town, some ports are run by the country, some ports are run by individual organizations, some ports are run by bespoke groups of vendors working together in the one spot. And so they come up with great architectures. If you're a comp sci major and you want to deploy a unique architecture that's never been seen anywhere in the world before, go to work for a port. They have jobs for people like you. And here's what you end up with. You end up with organizations where you have a mix of public and private, nautical and maritime. You have cargo and trade blending all the way across here. It could not be more complex unless you start talking about processes like semiconductor manufacturing. This is the port of Barcelona. It and San Diego were both victims of cyber attacks where people took over the systems and lost traffic, rerouted cargo, and sometimes cargo vehicles were actually deleted from the system. The most intriguing of these took place back in 2011 through 2013. This was a 3-year-long hack. The bad guys hacked into the systems at the Port of Antwerp, and they lost cargo containers. Containers full of cocaine, weapons, in some case terrorists or criminals fleeing prosecution, got into the Port of Antwerp. The box that they were living in was successfully moved where it was. It disappeared from inventory, and then folks came in and took the stuff, brought the people out. The people in Antwerp noticed something was amiss, and so they started locking down some of these systems. They got rid of the user one password for all of the admin consoles, and they thought they'd got it wrapped. And then the bad guys broke into the control system, and they hacked all of the machinery and replaced all of the updates. It went on for 3 years. Organized crime group ran for a long time. Ultimately, there were arrests. The U.S. Transcom assessment of our ports led to the following conclusions: that the cargo management systems were high risk, that the cranes in the older ports were relatively safe because you still had to have a human being managing them, but in automated environments, they were unconnected. Now, Trend has published reports on remote cranes, on hacking radio signals used in large warehouse distribution centers and ports, and also the problems with protocol translators, which are very simple but highly vulnerable pieces that link systems. They take your Modbus and convert it to, port 504, 506 for Modbus over IP. Those things can be hacked as well, leading you to allow DDoS attacks or misdirection or all sorts of hijinks. And then finally, the scanning systems themselves are mostly automated, and they are connected to the network, and they are often internet facing. In other words, it is a hacker's playground. Okay, so that's the situation. We have unprotected technologies. We have unique bespoke architectures at every port. We have multiple opportunities for attack. So where do you start? Well, that's what this section is about. Many of you will have heard of the Lockheed Martin kill chain analysis. Anybody? Yeah, not, okay. They said, here are the things that a hacker has to do. And this was great for me because there's an adage, like so many, and you should get Spaff's book because he talks about this in detail, that says the bad guy only has to get one thing right and they win, whereas the good guys have to get everything right or they lose. Well, in reality, the bad guys don't have it so easy. The Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain talked about all the things the bad guys have to do in order to successfully hack a system. Well, there was a paper written about 2 years ago on the unified kill chain. Doesn't have the marketing oomph that Lockheed Martin was able to put behind the cyber kill chain, but this is the larger model. The nice thing about this model is that it is more comprehensive than the Lockheed Martin event. It also is designed to fit comfortably well with the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So I've become an advocate for the unified kill chain analysis, and I have the reference for this at the end of the document. All of the material has references at the end of the document. You can't read the small print, so I replicated some of the stuff. These are all the things that a bad person might have to do to get into your system. Find out what's there, discover what they can live off the land on, get stuff to you, maybe convince somebody to click on a link, getting a lot easier with ChatGPT, creating those believable things. They got to be able to get credentials, they got to be able to move across the system, and so forth. The point is that being a hacker isn't as easy as it might look for those of us that aren't hackers. In fact, if you saw the dump from one hacking site of another's, there were internal emails about people complaining about long hours and not enough money, and I don't like my boss and all that, which was really quite heartwarming to think that these schmoes are just as bad off as anybody else. So, using this model, okay, now we know what to do. So, how do we do it? And this is the most important chart in the deck. And as I said, this harkens back almost 50 years. Functional decomposition. You take a look at the process and you describe it. Now, in the formal definition of functional decomposition, your description has to be a verb with a single object. Secure the port. And then you analyze that to the next level. Say, well, in order to secure the port, I have to identify assets. You see, it's verb, object, and you go through that process. Well, I'm going to use an entirely different environment to show how this works. And this is a little bit of self-pleading. I grew up in a mining town in southern Arizona where they mined copper. So I'm going to talk about what it's like to mine copper. You got some people digging in a hole, bringing up copper ore, it gets smelted, and it gets to the shelf. Well, there's a little bit more to it than that, including the misspelling on the word distribution. I apologize for that. My mom, the English teacher, would have never let me forget that. And I've internalized that. And how far do you go? How far do you go with the functional decomposition? Well, you get to what we called at IBM the FRU, the field replaceable unit. Once you've got down to the thing that you can take out and put a copy in, you don't have to go any further. Once you've gotten down to the chip, you don't have to get down to the level of the semiconductors or the design. You just replace the chip and that's it. So the process is iterative, but it does terminate. So we're going to take a look at the top level, the middle levels, and then we're going to take a look at the bottommost level in getting some copper wire to your house. So how do we do? High level, well, we refine the ore into copper, extrude into filaments, we wrap them sometimes with an insulator, package, ship it. And so here's what the supply chain looks like, a little more detail. It starts off in the mine. That mine on the bottom left is the Copper Queen mine. Bisbee's a great town to visit. And then it goes by train to the smelter, which is in Douglas, 24 miles away, and that's the smelter. Runs 24/7. In fact, if the smelter turns off, they have to dynamite it because once the slag hardens, it can't be loosened up. It has to be rebuilt. So it goes to the smelter, and from there it's taken from one level of purity to a higher. It goes on to train. It goes to El Paso, the electrical refinery. Then it goes by train to port, and the ingots at 99.999% are shipped all over the world, where they're then converted at factory, warehoused, and trucked to another factory for distribution, and they get to your shop. So let's take a look at the first step. Copper ore these days is about 0.25% copper. So you mine a ton of ore and you get 50 pounds of copper. How do you do that? Well, you drill a hole, you blow the rock face, you crush the ore, and then you mix it with acidic water from the mine, and you put it in a leach field, and that dries, and what you're left with is a concentrate that's now 30% copper. So you've gone from 0.25% to 30%. Then you put that dry slurry into a train and you ship it to the smelter where they do the refining. These are the leach tanks, also visible on the south side of Bisbee, not active anymore. Mines closed down in the 70s. If we're going to apply this method to the maritime supply chain, we say, okay, what's the piece that we're going to look at? And I've circled two things. If we're just looking at train to port to ship to port to truck, that's one thing. If we're doing multimodal, right, that's the container all the way to the factory, then you have the dotted line. But we've scoped the problem. And think about all the little things that have to happen. The dynamite has to be the right charge. The assessment of the strength of the rock has to be done accurately. The person loading the car has to know when it's full based on the humidity, the water content of the ore. The train itself is fueled for the trip and for the angle of the road, because Bisbee's in the mountains, Douglas is a little further down in the plain. At every step, it is a human and mechanical and electronic system. The controls are all over the place. You can bribe a foreman, or you can hack some equipment in order to cause something to go wrong. So the car derails, or it gets there too soon, or it runs out of fuel on the way to the smelter. All of these vulnerabilities are analogous to what happens inside the maritime environment. So let's take a look at that. Automated maritime environments are extreme, limiting case of supply chain. A fully automated port does loading and unloading. The only person involved in the process is the person driving the truck. And that individual doesn't touch anything. They just wait for it to get filled. Which container gets off, in which order, where it goes on the cargo ship, which container on the cargo ship comes off, where it goes in the warehouse, and how it's loaded onto the various trucks and where the trucks go. That is all done entirely automatically, and therefore hackably. There are risks to shipping. I talked about the unbalanced load. I mentioned the Russians messing with the GPS for beaconing, disruption of supply chain, NotPetya, which got a little bit out of hand. Thanks be to our good friend who was arrested for stopping NotPetya because of something he did when he was a teenager. And in specific, when you have hybrid environments, manufacturing where there are physical components, where there are people involved making decisions, where there are handoffs from one mode to another, where there are interfaces, those of you who've done software testing know that the bugs live at the edges. The handoffs are the most vulnerable component. There are elements of this that are themselves dangerous. How much dynamite do you put into the charge? Where do you put the blasting caps? How far apart do you drill the holes? If you drill them too close and put in too much charger, you can collapse the whole mine. If you drill them further apart and don't put in enough charge, then you've just wasted a day's worth of effort. All of these things are vulnerable to attack. All of these things need to be constrained and protected. With reference to the supply chain software aspect of it, the components for these things come from multiple sources. We recently did a report looking at machine tools and CNC machines, and there you have a multi-level supply chain where there are manufacturers for the CNC devices, and then there are other manufacturers who take those devices and put them into the machines. So one group builds the software in the controller, another group builds the actual drill or lathe or what have you. Constant mergers and acquisitions means stuff doesn't always show up in time. You got to know what you've got in order to protect it. Those of you who remember the Equifax vulnerability, the issue there was the Apache Struts vulnerability was known, it was identified, there was an alert sent out, Equifax got the alert, their CIO said, do we have Apache Struts? The team looked around and said, nope, we're clean, neglecting a recent acquisition with a subsidiary that did in fact have deployed Apache Struts. They hadn't integrated their software asset management systems, and therefore they were vulnerable and a very noisy problem. We have to be aware of shadow IT and shadow OT and shadow communications technology. We all know shadow IT, right? The boss says, going back a few decades, we can't have local area networks, there's no Wi-Fi allowed in the building. So the supervisor says, well, I'll just trot down to Fry's, and for $99.95, I get a Wi-Fi access point, and I put it in. I'm a hero to my team, right? Shadow OT, people using devices to strengthen the depth of their systems. In a related environment, we had a hospital in New Jersey. One guy was caring for an elderly parent, and he was a nurse, third shift. And for his parent, he got off the internet a $50 pad that would note if the person moved or if the moisture content changed, meaning I got to go take care of Pop. He said, you know what, let's bring these into the hospital. So I got these 50 devices, 50 beds, $2,500, and now if a patient moved, the nurse was able to get there and see what it was. If there was a sudden increase in humidity, they'd go see if there was a problem. And what happened was the patients got better care, the nurses were more productive, everybody was happy. And the other nursing groups found out about it. And pretty soon, every bed in this 2,000-bed hospital had these cheap little $50 devices off there. So that was all well and good until the head of nursing went to the CIO, said, can you secure these, please? And the CIO said, what have you done? He says, well, we put these moisture sensors. Yeah, but these aren't HIPAA compliant. There's patient information flowing over these Bluetooth connections unauthenticated. Why didn't you just buy the beds? There are hospital beds that have these in there. Head of nursing said, yes, right, the hospital beds cost $8,000 a piece. These pads cost $50. I spent $100,000 across 15 departments and nobody noticed. If I put in a capital requisition for $16 million for new beds, the answer would be no, never, not ever. Shadow OT. And shadow communications technology, well, my cell phone's over there, I feel naked, but it's right there, connects to anything, 6, 7, 8 different EM bands, plus visual, plus sound, plus motion. All these things together weaken the environment. I'm not saying don't bring your phones to work. What I'm saying is the IT organization has to get smarter about how these things work. And the OT group, the production control function, has to understand how they're introducing vulnerabilities in the environments. There is a catalog of known exploited vulnerabilities. CISA puts things in there saying, hey, not only is this bug live, but we've seen actual exploitation in the field. However, As with Equifax, if you don't think you've got that code, you're not going to do anything to remediate that vulnerability. So you've got to take a look at what you've actually got installed. You've got to ask your vendors to improve the security things. Now, most of us, we ask our vendor, hey, Microsoft, why don't you? And it's like, thank you very much for your input. There are ways to get around that. Just a side note on the buying power of the industry, I've had too many colleagues during my 12 years at Gartner who would say things like, well, the buying power of the federal government will demand. I say, no, it doesn't happen. Because if you're in manufacturing, what happens if the federal government comes up with a spec for a part that you make? You come out with a federal registered version of the spec of the part that you make, and that costs $700, and then the commercial one costs $250. If the federal government had used the purchasing power of the government to enforce seatbelts, we'd have seatbelts on the Abrams tank, we'd have seatbelts in US Postal Service vehicles, and maybe some fighter planes. So what you have to do is regulation. There will be regulation, we're getting smarter about that. That is how ultimately organizations are going to respond to this because they don't want to be sued and they don't want to be facing court. So what do we do to mitigate and prepare for this? Securing multimodal supply chains comes down to knowing who cares. Who are the constituents? Who are the users? Who are the consumers of what it is you're doing? Who do you rely on to get your job? This is not unlike a business continuity assessment. Who cares if we're down and how do they care? Who cares if there's vulnerability and how do we care? What agreements do you have with your suppliers to notify you of a change that could impact you, either a change of the spec or a change in the staff? If you allow your supply chain vendors to come on site and fix things, how do you authenticate those people? What kind of connections do they require that you have open? You've got to identify key services, the ones that will actually shut the business down if they're not there. And build a model, build an architectural model. I guess the better phrasing would be to say, make your architectural model explicit, right? We all have an information architecture, we do. The only question is, do we know what it is, right? If you make it explicit, then you can talk about it, you can improve it, you can strengthen it. More concretely, segment your network. You don't want somebody to come in here and get all the way over there unimpeded. Create a cyber emergency response team. Put people in place who will be able to track down things, take a look at what's going on in their world and say, oh, what do we do about it? Now, train users, and I want to be really careful about being understood on this. There is another old saw in cybersecurity that says the end user is the weakest link. That is a lie. And here's how I can prove that. I want you to imagine an employee of your organization is just wandering down the hall and she looks in an office and sees someone doing something that might be wrong. I want you to ask her 3 questions. First, would she know if it's wrong? Second, would she choose to report it? And third, if she picked up the phone, would she know who to call? Now, to turn that into bureaucratese, is there fundamental awareness? Is there a culture of security? And do you have the management mechanisms in place to sustain that culture? If the answers are yes, yes, and yes, you've won. And it doesn't matter what technology you've deployed because your people will make it work. But if there's a no in there, if the employee doesn't know if it is wrong or not, or they say, that's wrong, and so they decide maybe they'll do something and they talk to their boss, and their boss says, well, yes, you do raise an interesting point, but that's not our area, and we shouldn't really meddle. Or they know somebody who did report a problem and now nobody will eat with them at lunch, right? Or they decide they're going to do something, they know it's wrong, and they pick up the phone and they call the help desk and say, I'd like to report a security issue. And the help desk says, let me put you in touch with site security, who wants to know where the fire is, right? In that case, if there's a no in there, you've lost. And again, it doesn't matter what technology you've deployed because the game's over. Technology has almost nothing to do with the integrity of your information security program. So by training users, I mean lead by example. I mean have the boss do something and have his aide report it loudly. Oh, Fred got called on the carpet. And make sure your users are authenticated. Know who they are, know what they should do. Multi-factor authentication is crucial for this. Anybody who's not considering it, there are 3 other sessions on this floor right now telling you why you should. I won't rehash that argument. And patch and update technology where you can. I recognize, especially in OT environments, this is a pipe dream, but protect what you can, segment the network, put, IDP, intrusion detection prevention technology in place, at least a firewall, for heaven's sake. And look to smarter technology when you get to the next refresh, whenever that rev might be. Integrating IT with OT is a tough problem. If you look at the mandates for information security, right, data should not be lost, altered, or inadvertently disclosed. Right? Nothing in there about preservation of the underlying service. Right? Actuators aren't even in scope for IT. They're not considered IT devices. So what you need to do is you need to say, what are the cultural mismatches? We've spent so much time polishing our cylinders of expertise, a nicer way of saying silos, right? That we gaze at our reflection and we don't really see what's inside the neighbor. Take somebody from the security group and put them into a production group. Take somebody from production, put them on the help desk for a while. Walk in each other's moccasins for a mile, and all of a sudden it will become clear. When you do look at security, IEC 62443 is really good. I'm on a group that is looking at extending it, going right now. They could use help. And finally, make sure that your security capabilities, where you can deploy them, you want to break the network into pieces, you want to take a look at the traffic, you want to log everything that you can. Take a look at advanced architectures. This is not a plug for ARM, this is just the way they're doing things these days, and most of the vendors that provide processors for OT are in the same boat. They have two parts to the hardware. Closer to me, there is a secure piece of hardware that has its own firmware, that has its own root for trust. That is very, very tough to update. You need to have authentication, and it does not have a default password with it. And then the stuff on the far side, that's what the system is meant to do. It's meant to count the number of widgets that roll past it. It's meant to weigh the volume of material on the scale and so on. So you can update the easy stuff without messing with the hard stuff. This gets around the problem of the limited capacity of most chips out there. These things are not that expensive, a few pennies more, and you'll be ahead of the game to put them in there, because I guarantee you that by 2028, this stuff will be mandated. You'll have to have a secure component. Now, yes, it can be hacked. If you are diligent, you can find a way in there. But the goal is not to make your thing a fortress. The goal is to make it hard enough that the hackers who are on the clock are going to go somewhere else and try to attack that. So you want to slow them down. So, what do we recommend? I would like you to take a look at the hardware and software components. And by software, I don't mean the programs, I mean the data as well. And see what the flows are. Where does it come from? Where does it go? Where does it reside? At what phases, if it is public facing, is it encrypted, and how is that secured? Over the next 3 months, I want you to do the first 2 levels of that functional decomposition and say, okay, where are the vulnerabilities? And having the map that you built in the next week or 2, you'll be able to say, okay, which known exploited vulnerabilities do we currently have? And of those, which really could harm the business in a big way? Use the spreadsheet again against your material and apply the unified cyber kill chain, unified kill chain analysis. Again, there's a reference at the end. And then in the next 6 months, I want you to enforce and reinforce your most vulnerable steps. I want you to take a look at the handoffs. Use audit principles. Is there separation of duties? Who checks that the supervisor did the right thing? Who verifies that the scales are correct? Right? You pump gas and there's a sticker that says this gas thing was registered by the supervisor of measurements for the city of Norwalk, Connecticut in September of 1996. Oh, good, right? And make sure you don't forget the handoffs between groups. And these are the references that I mentioned. Copies of the presentation will be available through them, or you can come up and see me. Thank you very much for your time and attention. If we have any questions, I'll take them. If not, snack time.